Before we get into today's video properly, if you're new here, welcome. I'm Paula, and on this channel we focus on understanding crypto and the markets beyond the noise. That means fewer wild predictions, less emotional hype, and more time spent looking at what's actually being built behind the scenes, how the financial system really works, and where things might be heading over the long term. And XRP is one of those topics where that kind of perspective really matters, because there are very few assets in crypto that trigger such a strong reaction. Some people are convinced XRP is one of the most misunderstood projects in the entire space. Others are just as convinced it should have disappeared years ago. And what's interesting isn't that people disagree, it's that the disagreement never really ends. No matter how many new coins launch, no matter how many narratives rotate in and out of fashion, XRP keeps being pulled back into the conversation, even in quiet markets, even when it's not leading the hype, and even when people are tired of hearing about it. So today I want to slow this right down. Not to hype XRP, not to tear it down, and definitely not to talk about price targets. Instead, I want to look at why XRP keeps coming up year after year, what's actually been happening quietly in the background, how this ties into much bigger shifts in global finance, and why the next few years could matter, not in a speculative sense, but in a structural one. Because when you step back far enough, XRP starts to look less like a failed narrative and more like infrastructure that was built early for a world that's only just starting to take shape. To understand XRP properly, you have to start with what it was actually built to do, and just as importantly, what it was never meant to be. XRP wasn't designed to be digital gold. It wasn't built as a store of value narrative. It wasn't created to power NFTs, gaming, or speculative DeFi ecosystems. It was built to solve a very specific institutional problem: how to move value efficiently between different financial systems that don't fully trust each other. That problem still exists today. Even now, international payments rely on infrastructure that's decades old. Money moves slowly, fees are opaque, liquidity gets locked up around the world just to keep the system functioning, and settlement can take days. Banks don't do this because they enjoy inefficiency. They do it because the system was never designed for real-time global settlement. XRP's role was to act as a bridge, not something you hold forever, but something you use briefly. A neutral asset that can move value between currencies and jurisdictions without requiring every institution involved to trust each other or to pre-fund capital everywhere. That original design choice explains almost everything people find frustrating about XRP today. Crypto as a market runs on narratives, and narratives need excitement. DeFi promised yield, NFTs promised ownership, gaming promised mass adoption, AI promises relevance. XRP promised efficiency, and efficiency doesn't trend on social media. That's why XRP often feels out of place. When speculation is driving markets, XRP looks slow. When hype is rotating quickly, XRP looks stuck. And when retail excitement is the main engine, XRP feels unsatisfying. But here's the flip side. Projects built on narratives rise quickly and fall quickly. Projects built on infrastructure move slowly, but they tend to survive. XRP hasn't survived multiple cycles because it captured the imagination of retail traders. It survived because its use case exists outside retail imagination altogether. And this is where it's important to separate XRP from the company that's done much of the heavy lifting behind the scenes, Ripple Labs. Ripple's strategy has never really been about convincing individuals to buy XRP. It's been about convincing institutions that blockchain-based settlement can work within the existing financial system. That means custody, that means compliance, that means regulation, that means integration with legacy infrastructure. Over the years, Ripple has invested heavily in acquiring and building the rails institutions actually need: payment infrastructure, liquidity tools, custody solutions, and increasingly frameworks for tokenizing real-world assets. These aren't consumer-facing products. They don't launch with a fanfare, and they don't move quickly. But they're the prerequisites for real adoption. One of the most common frustrations people express about XRP is timing. Why has this all taken so long? Why are there still pilots? Why does everything feel like it's coming soon? The honest answer is, this is exactly how financial infrastructure adoption looks. Banks don't rip out settlement systems because a new technology exists. They test it quietly, they run parallel systems, they conduct regulatory reviews, they wait until the risk of not upgrading becomes greater than the risk of upgrading. What's changing now is that many of those experiments are moving closer to real-world implementation, not because crypto got more exciting, but because legacy systems are under real pressure to modernise. Instant settlement is no longer optional. Tokenization is no longer theoretical. Digital assets are no longer fringe. Which brings us to geography. Japan's role in the XRP story is often misunderstood. Japan didn't embrace XRP because it's exciting. It embraced XRP because it was clear. Early regulatory clarity classified XRP as a payment-focused cryptocurrency rather than a security, which gave institutions the certainty they needed to engage. While XRP was tied up in legal ambiguity elsewhere, Japan moved on and started building. Major financial groups committed to XRP-related infrastructure, not just at a marketing level, but at a balance sheet level. Joint ventures were formed, systems were integrated, long-term strategies were built around cross-border payments and liquidity corridors. Japan is one of the most conservative financial systems in the world. It doesn't move on hype, it moves on long-term planning. And that's why its involvement with XRP matters. But Japan isn't alone. Outside of Japan, XRP-powered or Ripple-enabled infrastructure has been most relevant in regions where cross-border payments aren't just a convenience, they're a necessity. In Southeast Asia, where remittances and traditional trade are vital, reducing settlement time and cost has real economic impact. In the Middle East, where financial hubs are actively modernising infrastructure to support global trade routes, blockchain-based settlement is seen as a strategic advantage. In parts of Latin America, where remittances make up a significant portion of household income, reducing friction matters more than speculative narratives. These regions don't care about crypto culture wars. They care about cost, speed, and reliability. That's where XRP's original design still makes sense. What's interesting is that when you zoom out and listen to how macro analysts talk about XRP, the focus is almost never on price or short-term market cycles. It's usually about settlement, liquidity, and where value actually moves in a modern financial system. Across different analysts and institutions, you hear the same themes repeated in different language. The infrastructure gets built quietly, that adoption starts in conservative markets, and that by the time something looks obvious to the wider market, the groundwork has usually been in place for years. That doesn't mean XRP is guaranteed to succeed, but it does explain why it keeps coming up in serious macro conversations long after most hype-driven projects have faded away. And once you understand that framing, the next part of the story starts to make sense. Tokenization is where everything starts to connect. Over the last few years, tokenization has shifted from a niche crypto concept to a core topic in traditional finance. When people like Larry Fink talk about the future of markets, they're not talking about speculative cycles. They're talking about putting stocks, bonds, and funds on digital rails so they can settle instantly and move with far less friction. Institutions like the Bank for International Settlements have openly discussed tokenization as a way to reduce counterparty risk, improve liquidity, and modernize settlement systems. In other words, tokenization isn't being framed as disruption, it's being framed as an upgrade. But here's the part that often gets missed. Tokenizing assets is the easy part. What's hard is everything that comes after. Once assets live on chain, you need to move value between systems, currencies, and jurisdictions instantly and reliably. You need settlement layers that don't require trust between every party involved. You need liquidity that can move when it's needed, not days later. This is where XRP's original design suddenly feels less outdated and far more early. XRP wasn't built for a world where assets stay locked inside national silos. It was built for a world where value needs to move seamlessly between systems that don't fully trust each other. That's exactly the problem tokenization creates once it starts being used at scale. If tokenization grows, something has to sit in the middle. And historically, the most valuable parts of financial systems aren't the flashy front ends. They're the rails underneath that everything else depends on. So, could 2026 really matter? Not in a hype sense, not in a price prediction sense, but structurally, yes. The mid-2020s matter because this is when experimentation starts turning into implementation. Tokenization pilots are maturing, regulatory frameworks are becoming clearer, legacy systems are under pressure to modernise. If XRP benefits, it won't look like a sudden explosion of excitement. It will look like quiet integration, gradual use, and increasing relevance. That's a very different kind of bullish. So, the bigger picture, XRP doesn't need everyone to love it. It doesn't need viral narratives, and it doesn't need retail excitement. If it works because systems rely on it, not because people talk about it. And that's why, after all these years, XRP is still here, still being built on, still being tested, still showing up in serious financial conversations, even when the market isn't paying attention. If you've made it this far, you're probably someone who wants to understand crypto, not just react to it. That's exactly why we built the Crypto Liftoff course. It's completely free and it walks through how we approach crypto across bull and bear markets, focusing on structure, risk, and long-term thinking rather than hype. You'll find the link in the description if you want to check it out. So I'll leave you with this question. Is XRP outdated technology that missed its moment, or infrastructure that was built early and is only now approaching the environment it was designed for? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you found this video helpful, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.